Midterm elections now just days away, and how the night ends is anyone's guess.
Republicans are optimistic they can take over not only the U.S. House, but also the Senate. And that new balance of power could significantly impact not just President Biden's agenda, but the country for years to come.
With inflation surging to a 40-year high, the economy is a very or most important issue for 85% of voters. Education or schools and crime round out the top three issues.
Democrats hope the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade would energize voters and hand them more midterm victories. But polling suggests that candidates are struggling in blue states like Oregon and California, where voters feel the issue is settled.
In the next half hour ahead, we'll analyze where we are right now, the dynamics to watch going into Tuesday, and what would change if Republicans took power in Congress. This is Election 22, What Matters, from the Washington Post and Newsy.
Now, from the Washington Post newsroom, Libby Casey and Andrew Rafferty.
Well, this time next week, we should know the outcome of most races, but there are a lot of contests to keep track of.
So we thought it'd be helpful to start off this episode, our finale, with a brief voter's guide to the midterms. For that, we welcome James Hohmann, opinion columnist with the Washington Post, who is covering the election. So, James, we all want to know who wins and loses. So what should we watch early on Tuesday night that might give us a sense of how the races are going?
Libby, I'll be paying close attention to the tiny state of Rhode Island. Obviously, polls close first on the East Coast, so we'll start to get returns here early. There's a House district there that Joe Biden won by 14 points 2 years ago, and a Republican, Alan Fung, looks like he's in striking distance. If Fung wins, that's a very good sign for Republicans. On the Senate side, I'll be watching New Hampshire and North Carolina, where there are two Senate races in states that count ballots quickly. If Democratic incumbent Maggie Hassan looks like she's going down in New Hampshire, it's pretty much game over for Democratic hopes of winning the Senate. Similarly, if Sherry Beasley, the Democrat in North Carolina, is outperforming expectations against Ted Budd, the frontrunner, a Republican congressman, then that will suggest that it's going to be a knockdown, drag-out fight across the night and across the map.
What are you going to be watching for in terms of voter turnout, James?
We're in this new era of just really high turnout elections, especially in midterms. Tens of millions more people voted in 2018 than voted in 2014. I expect that to continue in 2022. We saw it last year in the Virginia governor's race. And that makes it hard to know how much stock to put in the polls, because it's really hard to guess just what the electorate is going to look like. Democrats are activated around the abortion issue. Republicans are activated because they're out of power.
And James, the other big question here is, when are we going to know who the winners are? And so what are you looking for, especially in some of those states that look like they have really, really tight Senate contests?
Well, there may be a runoff in Georgia that takes us into December if neither candidate gets 50%. Remember, in 2020, control of the Senate came down to Georgia. That could happen again in 2022. But the three states where people should expect a delay in counting are Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Arizona. All three of those states have significant early voting, and all three of those states wait to start counting their early votes until Election Day. So you remember back in 2020, Election Day became Election Week. Something like that could happen again if these states determine control of the Senate.
All right, James Hohmann, thank you so much for the overview. I know you'll be busy between now and election night. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Let's bring in the first of our two reporter roundtables. Newsy anchor Del Walters is in Atlanta, site of that hotly contested Senate race. Newsy national political correspondent Alex Miller is in New York, where the state's gubernatorial race is suddenly closer than most people thought it could be. And here in our studios, the Washington Post senior correspondent Rhonda Colvin is just back from Ohio and Nevada with insight into undecided voters. Welcome to you all. Del, we just heard from James that it's possible Georgia's Senate race could go to a runoff if neither candidate gets 50% of the vote next week. This is so high stakes that some $145 million has been spent on campaign ads. Why is this race so contentious?
Because everybody understands from the last time there was a runoff in Georgia, it dictated control of the Senate. And I think one of the things is that people here aren't necessarily looking at the issues. as much as they are about who is going to control the Senate, whether it's going to have an R or a D in front of it, which is one of the reasons why this race is so close. You hear people say, how can Herschel Walker continue to be neck and neck with a man who actually, has taken over the pulpit of the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King? And yet he is trending well with African-American voters, and he is trending well with Georgia voters. So it lets you know that sometimes people look past the issues that we see as reporters and look more to the issues that they say will affect their lives further down the road.
Rhonda, you recently visited Nevada and talked to voters who've chosen to register as nonpartisan, and it's a sizable percentage of voters there. Why are they choosing not to affiliate with the party?
It is a sizable percentage of the voters there. In fact, Nevada has the number of unaffiliated voters, voters who are not choosing to be Republican or Democrat but want to vote in this election. They're about a third of the voter rolls there, and they're on par with both parties. And what I'm hearing from voters there is the reason why they don't want to subscribe to a party right now, it may be very obvious to some. One is that our politics have become very toxic, very volatile, and folks don't want to sign up for that. So that's one reason for the high number of unaffiliated voters there in Nevada and elsewhere, like North Carolina. That's another state that has a lot of nonpartisan voters. The other thing that's driving this trend, from the expert I spoke to about this, is young people. As you have more Gen Z and younger generations sign up and become voters, they typically don't want to subscribe to any identities when it comes to their vote. So this is a trend that's been on the rise for a while, and it looks like it'll continue to be on the rise.
Rhonda, how are the candidates talking to those independent voters who might be in the middle or still might be searching for a home?
Well, one example I can give you is U.S. Senate candidate Tim Ryan of Ohio. His ads there feature him saying things about not wanting to be a part of the culture wars, that he's the politician that will be for the folks in the middle who just want someone to work for them in Washington. That might work. We'll see when those results are in, but I know that is a campaign that has really been driving that message hard to get voters, at least there in Ohio, energized who may not subscribe to being hard Democrats or hard Republicans. Now, the other side of that coin is you also don't want to alienate your base. So that's something that I'll be watching next week to see candidates who have been trying to meet those people in the middle, how well they do and at what margin.
So, Del, who are the voters that could swing the election in Georgia where you are?
I think it's the young voters, and I think it's the young voters all across the country. We're seeing that record turnout, and I think one of the things that we have a tendency to do is look at young voters as if they were locked in time in either 2016 or 2018 or 2020, when in fact they keep getting older as the election cycle continues and the issues change that affect them. I'm looking at North Carolina, for instance, where you have so many people in the Research Triangle area. You're looking at Ohio, a state that is economically moving, and you're seeing jobs now coming back. It's no longer the Rust Belt state. It's a state that wants to see itself as a tech state. So I'm looking at the demographic shift in this country as well. The number of mixed race marriages that are out there that weren't there in 2016, that are now seeing a different generational divide. So that's what I'm looking at more so than the polls, to see the numbers. And the numbers are overwhelming, that young people are finally saying it's time for them to take control of this country.
Andrew, President Biden and the Democrats are widely viewed as fighting against headwinds this year, and that's nothing new because the president's party generally suffers losses in the midterms, especially in the House. Have the Democrats been able to evolve or change their plan over the past month or two?
Yeah, well, I think the most kind of clear example of this is in their messaging around reproductive rights. We've seen a number of, especially House candidates, really kind of pivot from going hard on the idea of abortion access to now in the closing days of the campaign really focus on the economic message. And we've seen the same from the White House, where most of, whether it's messaging events from the White House or actually campaign events from President Biden or former President Obama, have really focused on that issue of the economy and making sure that they feel like they're addressing voters' needs. But there is something else interesting, I think, that might be going on here, because there are races where Democrats are going to do well, and it might be a large part because of reproductive rights. I'm thinking about Democrats, Josh Shapiro running for governor in Pennsylvania. And so I do wonder how much of it has to do with whether it's a specific governor who actually has a lot of power in a state to protect abortion access, or if it's a sitting senator or a member of the House when you really don't have that much power. Democrats are probably going to lose seats in one way or another, and if they haven't been able to protect abortion access now, it's hard to see how they would come next year, Libby.
You know, Alex, the surprise of the night could be the New York governor's race. How have Republicans made this a competitive race in what's been a reliably blue state?
Well, they've focused on one major issue, at least over the past few weeks, and that's crime. I spoke with a former staffer for Republican Governor George Pataki, who was the only Republican governor that we have seen in the state of New York since 1975. And he said in order for a Republican to win here, they would essentially have to run a perfect race, and that he would recommend that Lee Zeldin run just on crime and continue to talk about that. And that is what we have seen him do. He's not talking about guns when we're talking about crime, but he's talking about other issues that really tap into the fear that a lot of New Yorkers, particularly in New York City, have. If you look at the murder rates, those are down year to date. But if you look at other serious crimes, burglary, rape, assault, those are up. And that is what scares New Yorkers on the day-to-day basis. And so Zeldin has been able to tap into that. I should say, though, that a recent poll released says that Kathy Hochul's lead is actually widening at this point, but Zeldin really has been able to appeal to voters on this issue. Hochul is still trying to drive home abortion, not only touting her successes on abortion as she views them, but also talking about Lee Zeldin. When he was in his debate over the weekend, he said that he would not change any of New York's laws relating to abortion, and yet when you look at his record, he has been incredibly anti-abortion. So he knows he is walking an incredibly fine line, whether it's looking at abortion or whether it's looking at his support of the former president, because the former president, obviously not very popular in the state of New York, lost the state by 23 points in 2020, yet he voted to overturn the results of the election and actually stood by it. And so, yes, there is a chance that Lee Zeldin could win, but both sides say whatever the outcome is, it's likely to be marginal.
Oh. Well, thank you so much to Dale Walters in Atlanta, Alex Miller in New York, and Rhonda Colvin here in Washington. A quick break, and then we are back to look at the impact of what happens on Tuesday. What would Republicans do if they win control of Congress? That's next on Election 22, What Matters.
Oz might be a joke, but I don't believe any one of us finds it very funny, because abortion is on the ballot.
And Pennsylvania deserves better than Fetterman.
Those are the two leading candidates for U.S. Senate in Pennsylvania, Democrat John Fetterman and Republican Mehmet Oz. A lot is riding on this race because Democrats feel it may be their best shot at flipping a Senate seat held by a Republican. There are several Senate races we're watching especially closely heading into Tuesday. At the top of the list, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, and Ohio. Joining the conversation now, the Washington Post congressional reporter Mariana Sotomayor, Newsy congressional correspondent Nathaniel Reed in Ohio, and Newsy White House correspondent Willie James Inman is with us as well. So, Nate, both candidates in the Ohio Senate race have been barnstorming the state in the final days. What is their closing message to voters?
Well, J.D. Vance had somewhat of an eyebrow-raising closing message at the Fox News town hall on Tuesday night in Columbus, Ohio. His closing message to voters is, I'm going to be an independent senator, a voice for Democrats and Republicans. Let's listen.
At the end of the day, I'm going to represent the people of Ohio, and I plan to be an independent voice for the people of Ohio. Whether you're Republican, whether you're Democrat, whether you're independent, nobody is going to own my vote card. Nobody is going to own how I actually represent the people of Ohio. That's the thing that I intend to keep in mind.
And Tim Ryan, who's staked his claim on his bipartisan message, reaching out to voters across the aisle, not often using even the phrase Democrat in much of his advertising, has said that J.D. Vance has zero credibility on that message. His closing message to voters, it's okay to be a split ticket voter, especially for voters who might be voting for the incumbent governor, Mike DeWine, and who might want a split ticket and vote for him for U.S. Senate.
We're looking for voters, and there are some people who are saying, I'm going to vote some Republican, but I'm voting for Tim Ryan, and that's certainly okay with me. I think we need to get rid of the extremes. We got to come to the middle, and we have a huge and very robust Republican for Ryan initiative happening in the state right now, and I think that's going to make a big difference because we're pulling, 15 or 20% of Republicans in the state, and that's going to be a big deal.
And while some of the latest polling here shows J.D. Vance with a clear edge in the 11th hour of this Senate race, the polls are still showing about 8% of voters here are undecided. So that last-minute outreach is going to be extremely important from both of the campaigns.
Well, Willie, President Biden has been getting more involved in the closing days of the campaign after mostly staying off the trail in October. Why do Democrats feel he can be helpful now?
Well, Libby, I think is one major theme that the president has been trying to convey. What he's done with power thus far, talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law. Also, the president's presence, literally, it draws eyes. Many major media markets are where the president visits, and pitching that contrasting image between what he would do with an additional 2 years in power with the Democratic-controlled Senate and House versus that image coming from the Republicans. He's been doing that a lot more on the campaign trail thus far.
Now, Willie, you are from Georgia. You've been spending a lot of time there covering the Senate race, and you'll be back there on election night. What are voters telling you is driving their decision in the Senate and governor's races there?
Yeah, Libby, I'm always happy to get back to the Peach State. One of the things that I consistently hear from voters down there in Georgia is the economy and inflation. That is top of mind for voters there in Georgia. I think Democrats know that, Republicans especially know that. But when you really talk to Democratic voters in particular, they talk about not only the economy, but they also talk about abortion access. They talk about health care as well. For Republicans, it's inflation, the economy, and crime. That's certainly something that we've been seeing, especially in the gubernatorial race between Democrat Stacey Abrams and incumbent Republican Governor Brian Kemp. Both of those contrasting messages coming out of their campaigns, and also that's what I hear when I talk to voters as well.
Mariana, let's zoom out to what could happen. What would Republicans do in power if they take both the House and Senate?
Well, let's look at what the Republican House would do, because it's still in question if the Senate is able to win back, if Republicans in the Senate are able to win back the majority, and that could really change the calculus of what the House does. As of right now, Republicans only need to net 5 seats. That is likely, given just so many Democrats remain vulnerable on the map. And a lot of what Republicans are telling voters is Democrats are at fault here for inflation, for rising prices, and we are the party that can really rebound the economy. That's a little bit where the specifics lack, and a lot of members and Republican aides have been telling me that that is where, at the end of the day, if they take back control of the House, there's going to be a lot of debate. And there's different perspectives. It's going to be interesting to see who is elected in terms of ideological makeup, because there are a lot of Trump allies. If that conference grows within the conference itself, they might push for more extreme demands on things like not just on the economy, but also immigration, on crime. Those are other things that Republicans are out there talking about. And really what Republican leaderships will be able to do will depend on the Senate, largely because at this point, if the Senate does turn Republican, then maybe they could take more extreme steps. They are able to negotiate with that chamber. But if they don't, Republicans in the House know that a lot of their focus is going to be on investigating the Biden administration, given that it's unlikely their legislation will go anywhere in Congress and, of course, will likely be vetoed by President Biden.
So, Mariana, if Democrats keep control of one or both chambers, what are their priorities?
Well, if they do keep the Senate, it will be blocking anything that House Republicans send their way. But if both chambers are kept, first of all, it would be a huge sigh of relief for Democrats, many of whom are bracing for a pretty bad election night. They really do want to focus, and they've been talking about this on the campaign trail as well. How do you bring down prices in other ways? Trying to make things more affordable for people. They have obviously been touting the Inflation Reduction Act and some of those priorities there, like capping the cost of prescription drugs for seniors, but they want to make those benefits and apply them to many more people. So that is likely a priority. That's really where the focus for Democrats will be.
All right. Well, Andrew, I know you're probably sick of hearing the phrase, it will all come down to turnout, but take us inside the effort to get out the vote, because, don't hate me, Andrew, it may all come down to turnout. Talk to us about areas where Democrats might be optimistic.
Well, look, Olivia, I think if we take a step back here and we go back to January 2021, after Democrats had won that Senate race in Georgia and took control of the majority in the Senate, if you'd have told them 2 years later that they would have, essentially, it's pretty much a 50-50 shot of retaining the majority in the Senate, I think a lot of them would take that. So, when putting it in perspective, I don't think for Democrats, they can't expect to have too much better based on history, based on just the states that are in play this time around. And it's possible that they are able to slim the margin in the House and to a certain extent. But again, this idea of how reproductive rights is really motivating some of these key voting groups, that could be kind of their secret sauce. But as we've been talking about it seems like enthusiasm around that has been waning. There's been a number of signs.
We've been talking about how we're already seeing high turnout. Early voting is outpacing typical numbers. So, Nate, the night before the election, Republican J.D. Vance will hold a rally with former President Donald Trump there in Ohio, where you are. Trump's popularity is around or below President Biden's in most polls. So why is the Vance campaign doing this effort with Trump the night before the election?
Well, look, President Trump, I think, goes right back to the start of this Ohio Senate race. J.D. Vance only won his primary for a large part because of the Trump endorsement. That was an 11th hour endorsement when we were in the primaries. That helped J.D. Vance poll ahead of the pack. He was kind of polling on average at or around where Mike Gibbons or Matt Dolan were polling at that point in the race. And so ultimately, the Trump endorsement was quite decisive when it came to the primary election. So J.D. Vance has never kind of lost his roots there. He's appeared on stage with President Trump before. He's not been afraid to shy away from his support for the former president. And let's not lose sight of the fact that former President Trump did win this state in 2020 by about 8 points. And so it's going to come down to who he can build that election night coalition with.
Well, thank you so much, the Washington Post's Mariana Sotomayor and Newsy's Nathaniel Reed and Willie James Inman. Andrew and I are back in just a moment with some final thoughts as America votes. Back now to close out what we've learned over the past 9 weeks of this show and what we're looking ahead to this coming Tuesday.
Yeah, and Libby, the one thing I think I would say to our viewers and everyone else who's watching these returns is be patient. There are two things that really drive how quickly we know race results. Number one is how fast the votes are counted. Number two is how close the race are. And so we heard James talk about in places like Pennsylvania, probably the most watched Senate race, they don't even begin really processing these ballots until the day of the election. And then after that, they get processed, the early ballots, then they got to get counted. And so just because we don't know a winner on election night doesn't mean something nefarious has happened, doesn't mean that there's something bad going on.
And also, if who's winning or who's leading changes over time, that's because ballots are processed in batches, and you can't tell what's going to happen when the final tally comes in based on how things are trending early on.
Yeah, and I think the media as a whole did a pretty good job to explain that ahead of 2020, and it's kind of gotten lost into the midterms because there are so many other dynamics at play, but those same storylines, those same narratives, those same problems still exist in a lot of these states.
All right, well, we will all be watching to see just how this turns out. And we thank you so much for spending these past 2 months with us as we've uncovered the key issues driving this year's midterm election. We will be here live at the Washington Post on election night, and we invite you to join us. Our coverage begins at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on WashingtonPost.com and on our YouTube channel.
And I'll be part of Newsy's rolling coverage on that day beginning at 6 with more than a dozen correspondents across the country. And of course, we'll be bringing you the votes as they're tallied. I'm Andrew Rafferty of Newsy.
And I'm Libby Casey of the Washington Post. This has been Election 22, What Matters, a collaboration from the Washington Post and Newsy. Thank you for watching.